Hello everyone, so let's catch up with other questions from the public, aka my loyal followers that here proposed me some questions that I decided to pick in particular because I have actually many questions, as I often say, but that reflect a bit not just the variety, but at times also, and I will be critical in part, as I always am, naturally even for the best intentioned askers, so to say. Also, how they could be not necessarily improved because the content of the question is completely free, of course, but how could better serve the channel's purpose, right? Because, and this is actually partially separated from today's questions, but I encountered in the past some people, and that's why I often don't answer, or even in the comments, it happened in the past. Nowadays, not really, unfortunately, in fact, it's not very frequent. That is to say, people that make questions mostly because they want to make sense of themselves rather than really wanting to hear any answer. Maybe they have to display some knowledge or whatever. There's a limit to that as well, especially when this knowledge is like, on the channel, maybe on the relative video, I am talking something, and maybe the topic is even unrelated, but on top of that, it is really not how I have already explained the matter in other videos, and therefore sounds destructive to me, and becomes so for anyone who is going to read that, to accept that. So it happened, again, very few times in the past. This is, again, not specifically related to today's questions, but we'll see better how different, in fact, even probably the place where these guys come from, also in a literal but mostly figurative way, can be, right? So this was from Schwerpunkt to Schwerpunkt's email. It says, "Hi dear Schwerpunkt, I'm one of your anonymous follower on YouTube." This is a French guy. There's some mistake here and there, but it's not a problem, of course. "First, I would like to thank you for your work on YouTube, which helps me to fill in the gaps in what I know about history by adding content, above all, by joining the dots. Second, I apologize for my approximative English in this mail. I'm French. Third, I would like to ask you some questions about some topics you talk about among many others on your channel. I'm very interested in the onset of what we could call by misuse of language the state, not the modern state though, Claire. More particularly, I know little about the onset of states in India or China, but I know more about it in Europe and Middle East, which is also normal. In general, we know more about the latter than the former. My question is the following. Did the Greeks accept Macedonia and parts of Epirus from Polis and not the italics, form Polis and not the italics only because their civilization, or in the bracket Indo-European people settling their land older? So again, there are some mistakes here, but I think I understood the question. Was the Polis only one step further the italics? Let me explain my question. Okay, so it says different points here. The Greek polis was formed in the 8th, 7th century BC after the so-called Dark Ages, following the demise of the Mycenaean palaces, which were systems based on some kind of feudal and personal links between the central palace of the Wanax and a variety of local leaders. According to François de Polignac, La naissance de la cité grecque, the city was primarily formed by an integration from the periphery, with big peripheral sanctuaries in what would form the Escarai, where the various groups on the territories could take part into cults. Hera, Artemis, Demeter, Dionysus, various chthonic cults. Not entirely, telling the truth, to have a video on the Olympians coming, but in Artemis, yes, is obviously connected with the chthonic sphere, but is actually also part of the Olympian world in a specific sense. Now, they excluded left to found colonies based on the same scheme. Then central sanctuary formed. Thus, a polis is a unitary religious reality, the demos being only an administrative and civic circumscription. Then the italic basic political unit is not the polis nor the civitas. The basic unit is the Pagus, with a religious identity on its own cult, its own religious magistrates. The Pagi formed coalitions slash federations around federalizing sanctuaries and oppidas, the fact that the basic unit was the oppida is already plural, but we need to add the s. The fact that the basic unit was the pagus could explain how Rome could integrate the defeated peoples. You cannot actually integrate a polis, but you can add the pagus to your federal league. So why such a difference? We know that at the origin, these people had comparable structures with clanic tribes, equivalent Zippen, Corius, Comitatus, Mannerbund, sacred war bands. We know the Italics had, for instance, the sacred Samnite legion. We know the Greeks had it too with the Athenian Periotoloi and the Spartan Crypta. Other cases are found in other polis. We could even think that the periphery sanctuaries at the origin of the polis was formed by Corios, the Heraclids. I also made a video recently touching partly on this topic, since in Epirus, the Periotoloi formed communities quite autonomous from cities in Escatite that were shared by various polis which sent them senior officers. I have no evidence though. Was it because the Greeks were an older people, the various Italic peoples having ethnogenesis only in the 8th, the 5th? Well, they actually did earlier than that, but in any case. Was it because the Mycenaean prequel in Greece? Was it because, or thanks to the Eastern/Minoan influence, which created the Mycenaean palaces in the first place? Well, I would say so, largely. And this is in fact a type of question, as I was saying in the beginning, it actually largely finds its own answer. So it's mostly like, do you green light that? Do you check that? Yeah, I largely agree on the explanation. It says this question can be extended to Macedonia. I know much less about the local structures. In fact, we know less to begin with. What was the basic structure of Macedonia? No, it was not the autonomous polis before Philip II of Macedon. Why was it different from the other? From the rest of Greece, the steppe influence? I would be grateful if you could take the time to reply and point out where you disagree with what I say. Thanks, MB. So, first of all, I would like to say that today's questions are actually pretty dense. I could have made, again, a video for each, but then they would pile up, and I'm afraid I can't explain at length the whole thing. Here, there weren't actually too many questions at a time, unlike in other questions, say broader questions that I have to respond with an entire video to. So yes, I do think that the picture is actually much bigger in a sense. The scale of the answer should entail a much bigger picture than the polis, the localistic dimension as such, right? Given that the question starts from an idea of state, let's be concrete about the fact that even though there is surely, if you go back in time, here we mentioned the Mycenaeans as well, so the idea is that, of course, they had their own establishment there, and civilization does step up. So part of the question already addresses this. The basic way these people settled was not simply individual groups, right? Or like single clans, like as you see, for example, in the same way also in other migrations, right? Pick the migration era itself. Like you have actually entire peoples that already recognize themselves as something, right? Then there are some tribes that essentially have the ones that created those confederacies, and then you have the clans, and then you have also the familiar structures. So there is a hierarchy, all right? The question, as I was reading it, when this message was sent, can be answered. That is the first thing that came to my mind, is just on a bigger picture what had been going on in southeastern Europe, in the Balkans, in Greece, and even up to, in fact, Anatolia, with Hellenic culture that, as we explained also in the video about the Dorians, was a much sort of older, in that sense already established, stratified, and already tendentially crystallized one in the bigger picture. Definitely Italy was sort of less cohesive in that sense. In the origin, we know less about the Italic migrations. We know that the Italic peoples were basically already formed at the beginning of the first millennium BC. I mean, the Italic peoples as we know them later, so say the Samnites, the Umbri, the Latins, and so on. And that they themselves had some sort of broadly cohesive idea of each other, right? Besides, the civitas in this sense is perhaps older than we think. Consider that the Etruscans had their own cities that evidently had an influence from the East. I also recently made a video explaining how, also when we look at the Etruscans, we're not looking at ethnically different people per se. These at most would have been clans, groups from the time of the collapse of the Bronze Age, sea peoples, the raids of which the same early Italics participated. I made a video about this as well, that seized control of some parts, in that case, of Italy, with a much more, in fact, say Hittite, we can think mentality, a greater proximity with properly a urban dimension, and tendentially, in fact, a more political one, if we want to talk about the polis in Hellenic terms, even though they weren't the same thing. Indeed, the Greeks pioneered this, and in a sense also strengthened this already at a bigger scale than most of the urban communities that we know, for example, from the Levant at this point, did, right? One thing were, I don't know, probably the big city-states of Mesopotamia that were, however, taken over already by someone. When we look at the Hellenic civilization, we look at something fresh that has been swell, and like properly look at Hellenic colonization. That's something that, if you really think about it, can't be separated from the earlier Bronze Age collapse, sea peoples, invasions. At the end of the day, they really overlap. They're really the consequence of that lifestyle, just like saying, I don't know, the Viking era and the later Scandinavian crusades in the Baltic. Different directions, different sort of social cultural characteristics, but still, right? So a great deal is, yes, that there is a great continuity. So I think the question was answered 85% by itself. There was a greater proximity to civilization, so to already urban models from the East. Think about the influence of the Assyrians and the Hittites in the same development of the Hellenic phalanx. We talked about this in different videos with the Argos panoply and so on. There is indeed this thing of the sanctuaries that eventually coagulate the polis. Is something I think to either extremely archaic, like even before, in fact, the Bronze Age collapse. Otherwise, you see a great deal of continuity with in the Acropolis, for example, in its suburbs, when you look at the Mycenaean rocks and how essentially in later times there is a fresher sort of amount of more egalitarian peoples that came from the north and reinforced the ranks of the locals in some more tendentially anti-aristocratic fashion, hence the affirmation of the phalanx as opposed to war chariots. And in a bigger picture, it was taking place actually everywhere, also in Italy, everywhere where the chariot was falling in misuse, as a matter of fact. So I really think that the greater discriminant is the fact that Hellas was more civilized already. It was more stratified. It had more infrastructure. And it was easier in this sense for the polis to affirm itself further, for these urban centers to tendentially polarize, concentrate all those other forms of settlement and in fact what will become political participation from, in fact, historically more rural and more, in fact, apolite, literally, sense, if you think about these conquerors coming from Central Europe and so on. That was paradoxically sort of more universal even than what the Hellenic political system really arrived. So I would say this is the main answer. In fact, you see, as you pointed out, for example, with Macedonia, with the Pagus, that in these places the base for political development was more tribal, right? The cities were less influent. They essentially developed to an extent in the same way. Macedonia later sort of had polis within itself, but there is no doubt that the Macedonian establishment was primarily tribal and had a much more, in fact, sort of a rural dimension to its social cultural horizons provided that there were always important centers that in that sense are, for example, having sanctuaries, etc., in a more prominent, at least in relative terms, of greater importance, a bit like in Italy, all right? But also those places, in fact, I mean, in the Balkans were more exposed to a more crystallizingly sort of bedrock of civilization. In Italy, everything was much more fluid. So the Italics were, yes, based on these districts that were very rural. The Italics didn't have technically real cities, except, again, the Etruscans are not Italic, then there is an Hellenic colonization. But as you point out, in fact, the interland had this proto-urban dimension, a bit like the Gauls by the time that the Romans took them over. It's Aemilia. If you look at the Samnites, they were essentially some broader, a broader tribal confederacy, mostly based on shared pastures and this looser sense of Samnitic identity. It was affirming itself, in fact, in a more tribal fashion, or at some point, in fact, as a confederacy, a super tribal fashion. That's also why the Samnites were actually the strongest people in Italy to oppose the rise of Rome, that however rises at that point as a civitas, right? It consolidates as an actual state at the end of the day, and that's also a matter of sort of broader civilization. The Tyrrhenian coastland is definitely richer, more populated, more advanced, more exposed, in fact, to the aforementioned maritime contacts also with the Greeks, with the East. It's more densely populated. There are more sort of developed political systems, obviously enough. This is very different for the Apenninic interland. Doesn't matter how close it actually is. If you look at it, it's, from Italy from side to side, aside from the oblique direction, it's just a few hundreds of kilometers or some hundreds of kilometers, most with communications of the time. So on the Adriatic, it's all a different story, and you can appreciate this at that point if you're looking by shades. Think about, the Illyrians and how close they were to Epirus, for example, as well. So it's all, or even from the other side of the Adriatic, as they crossed into the Italian peninsula as well. So this is basically the reason. I agree with it. I agree with the fact that the Hellenes reaffirmed themselves as a people with the Dorian invasion over essentially the same strongholds of the Mycenaeans. They also relatively gradually transition into a political system meant as a polis. And there is an enormous continuity. The place was richer, was more stimulated, was more advanced, was more modernized, more secularized. You see, also made lots of videos about the differences between the Greeks and the Romans in general. Like, the Romans were much more archaically primitive than the Greeks probably in a very sort of mentally evident sense. I mean, the Romans, the Greeks already, but by the time of the Peloponnesian War, rationalized the entire story. They were still replete, of course, of religious deference and sort of mythological insight, etc. There's a lot. It's more like, also Greece is very feudal, even if you want to use at least this term. If you look at clienteles, at private relations, at oligarchies, at cavalry, right? But look at the Roman world. Still, Caesar was describing his conquest as a hero of the sagas, right? It's all about cavalrymen, infantrymen, about the moral dimension, about this warrior ethos. And so it's unfortunate that in education we sort of wanted to make of these people something that was much more, in fact, aligned with post-traditional mentality. Especially, I'm talking to a French follower. He knows pretty well what the extent of that ideological canceling of aristocratic, nobiliar, properly ancient regime culture, we can say, can reach, right? So that's why I would say that the question may start it should start from the above, right, as opposed from the below. It's not much like a territorial affirmation. It passes through that, but the peoples that cohesively, and also the more advanced, that take over and they have their political and social structures better documented, also do so because they have a shared sense of belonging to something bigger that dated, in fact, to the last big wave of Indo-European migrations that had, in fact, happened just in these times, as we've seen also in the recent video with the Dorians. The reactivation of solar symbolism, of swastikas, of full sort of population settlement, and basically the emergence of what we see as probably the ethnic profile of these Southern European population has happened for good from the end of the second and the beginning of the first millennium BC. So I think this is actually the best question of it all. Then, of course, we could get a bit more into the depths of how this structure or not was named, etc. But I wouldn't speak in this sense of state, not even in the modern sense of it, unless we're talking the polis per se. And as for the absorption, by the way, the confederation, in a sense, it was easier for the Italics to confederate under Rome, something that they would have likely not done. Rome had actually a very strong sense of power concentration and authoritarian domination. The Hellenes had, in a sense, emerged as with the polis as a counter to that older, more cohesive order from the top, right? So what Rome does is very unique and exceptional. So it's difficult to counterpose it to what was happening in Hellas in the meanwhile. However, you definitely realize that the Greeks, while very aware of their own identity as a whole, were hyper-fragmented in a way that, in fact, but a more tribal power from the north, like Macedonia, could achieve. It's as if those had been sort of the Italics of the situation and developing a bit more of a or permanently warlike and, in this sense, tendentially expansionistic power that the Greeks, in a strictly territorial sense, didn't quite have. They could send colonies out there, they could subjugate other polis, but they didn't have that societal engineering where the polis would simply use a citizen as a tendentially professional trooper that had to take over other places and make head to a sort of unitary overarching power, right? Everything was essentially a league of cities that would maintain their own separated identity, whereas with Rome, it's something that also eventually develops on the basis of cities with the civitates, but that, yes, had a very strongly cohesive collective sense of, okay, we are a tribe, we are essentially a war band on a bigger scale, let's go out there and conquer and replace and remold, and not just be so anchored here. And this is paradoxical because the Greeks had this, what we intend here, more democratic mentality that, however, did not really allow for a more developed sense of leadership on a territorial basis. Rome emerges from essentially a feudal background. That's the point. That were enormous estates already in archaic Rome, the one of the senators of the oligarchy that in this sense was not just a much bigger system, but one capable of simply bringing the city under its own control, right? And so it was, as Pyrrhus' own embassy to the Roman Senate, a congregation of kings made state, made res publica, as opposed to, this was something that in Hellas could have never happened because it was a culture that had rejected kingship, and together with that, essentially a world sense of probably anthropological identity, right? That departed from the one of the warrior, and that also tended to dilute it and or to exercise, to sort of even to countervene, because actually the original principle did not contemplate an absolute power that could be taken. But the Hellenes now were doing it in a more detached, mostly contemplative way, and were in this sense overrun by other peoples that had still a much more traditional view of what you should do with command, namely taking over the world, which Alexander did, Rome did, but the Hellenic polis didn't. So I don't know how useful of an answer this is, but again, bigger picture, tribes, nations, that sense, if one starts reasoning through polis, like the Greeks do, obviously there isn't already in mind a sense of expansion, right? And so it wasn't much a settled matter. Was probably an idea of structure or institution, but primarily an idea of the world, of the so-called mores, of what you have to do with power. This is probably the most difficult things to appreciate when we look at Rome, because of the way our history is being told to us, namely the fact that there was no broader moral, cultural, or religious reason why these major differences existed, right? Or a motivation, a broader force, etc. No, it's something that should start from the bottom up. That's not really, in a higher sense, how this thing actually worked. And by the way, there were powers all around throughout all time that were much more also power concentrated. If you think about it, even Carthage, that was in technically just a city-state itself, but not very much like the Greeks, something more oligarchic in nature, but not sending out demographic colonies, but basically controlling empire. It was, however, a hell of a big system. In the Levant, there were other great, namely the Achaemenid Empire, the Alexander's Empire at some point, also from a Roman perspective. So there were models out there that simply suggested what the ultimate goal of a people should be, namely the world's conquest. And so that's apparently what they exclusively cared about in absolute terms. And that's, in fact, in my opinion, the most interesting spiritual answer that we should give to this. How did the Greeks see, how inspired were they in their own great civilizational achievement by the same Achaemenid Empire? And what did Alexander do if not taking over the same? And what did Rome do if not following Alexander? That is actually the elephant in the room, among the many, the biggest elephant in the room. All right. So as I said, unfortunately, I would like to keep explaining for longer, and we can surely get there at some point with other questions of their development. But in general, this is my view on it. Minimal addition that answers sort of the touching point of the Hellenes and the Italics is that, as you know, there were expeditions from Epirus in Italy before Pyrrhus as well that were aimed at not merely, not initially conquering the Italic hinterland. That was still, however, possible aim, but rather saving the polis of Magna Graecia from the, in fact, massively sort of demographic and economic expanse of the Italic hinterland that was to overwhelm eventually with Rome. But, a king of Epirus died, killed by the Italics. There are other episodes, the Spartans defeated by the Veneti, northeastern Italy, and all these kind of other episodes that show you that, frankly, these people, the Italian hinterland could not be integrated because at large they were too warlike for the Hellenic world at that point, especially if you look at the political side of the story, again, at the polis, right? And for that matter, in fact, you can see that those, also when you look at the Balkan hinterland, like those areas of it that were maybe on the coasts Hellenic, but at the hinterland were at some point, we don't even clearly understand what. There was an Hellenic hinterland that was Hellenic in a broader national sense and was more rural, more barbarian. Think about, the Athenians or the Spartans, considering even the Boeotians, that were not among the least developed of the Greeks as some sort of barbarians, right? The same goes for Macedon in part, but for example, all those people from the Adriatic, the Ionian watershed, these weren't particularly cohesive populations. They had already in part been spent historically by the time of the Roman conquest. They didn't put up a major fight to begin with. Italy had yet to bloom with the Romano-Italic confederacy's expansion that would lead them toward domination. So at large, yes, there were some enormous forces within Italy that the Romans found the right alchemy to unlock, and that the Greeks basically, and probably by that point in history, after the Sea Peoples expanded, all sort of much more ancient dynamics had already sort of run out of steam in a broader moral, spiritual sense. That's why Macedonia does that in the north, and not, say, Athens or Sparta. Doesn't matter how sort of great their power, the thalassocracy and other sort of uniquely impressive features of Hellenic civilization were. There was something really different from what eventually Rome achieved. And Rome, at the end of the day, achieved this through relentless conquest of the same Italics, right? So whatever their societal structure at the root really was, there had to be a major war that basically throws everything under, and that transfigures properly the entire Italian landscape, also in a spiritual sense, because as we've seen in other videos about the Indo-European religion, the Romans literally inverted the fall from probably the decline of the golden models and of the earlier Indo-European conquest in the previous millennia in the Mediterranean and abroad, and especially in the war against Carthage, reaffirms probably the superiority of the virile, heavenly, Apollonian dimension. Also over Italics, that say the Sabines were as close as literally what is today the confines of the modern city of Rome. For example, mostly based on a lunar calendar. Well, also the Roman calendar was originally based on the lunar influence, and that's actually also a great part of what reveals the Roman seigneurial lordly vision of this, that there were some elements at the bottom that were never fully that remained foretesters, remained telluric, that remained, just to list the aforementioned tonic deities connected to those, but that the heavenly establishment, the senatores, the patres, managed to give an option to transforming them into world dominators and conquerors. This was simply not possible in a civilization like the Hellenic one, where the idea was that if you were even just a monocrat, right, you were a tyrant also in a negative sense, because at least the tyranny was seen positively as a veritable office in places like Syracuse, but that was considered like an aberration, even as the strongest at some point of the Hellenic polis, compared, from places like Athens, for example. The same Sparta being even more archaically connected to the fore and having a much more autarkic mentality for that matter. So again, very different systems, and it's something very interesting to confront as well later. Consider how whatever the polis was, how, the Macedons took over the East, started founding military colonies. They had the polis themselves, they relied very much on them, because by that point they were also the most advanced sort of cornerstone for domination, but they also needed an hinterland, a regional continental power to be actual empires, as a matter of fact. Other question, this is shorter, was from a YouTube video comment. It says, "Hello Schwerpunkt, thank you for all this great content. I would like to ask you for a question for the next Q&A. I have often heard you talk about the French, German and Italian ethnic groups in the medieval era. I totally agree that by the end of the 12th century and the beginning of the 13th, people were clearly identifiable, but where do you place the starting point for those ethnic groups? Is Otto the Great a German, quote-unquote, ruler, or simply a Saxon one? I'm pretty sure that William the Conqueror was French by the time of his conquest, but was Hugh Capet French? Karl Richard Breuil dates it to the 10th or 11th century, but maybe his work is outdated. The same question applies to the Italians. Does it start with Dante and his contemporaries? Thank you for your time." So this is actually the most important question here, and I really struggled today to say, okay, I should make a video only about this, but honestly, we can focus on the basics here, because great part of the reason why I could make a 3 hours long introduction in order to answer this question that is incredibly important, is really incredibly important. We can expand it further again at some other point, or some other Q&A and so on, is mostly the way we tend to misunderstand political, cultural, moral identities, when it's especially we reason just by the standard of 19th century nation state kind of identity. This is not to say that those do not exist. We live in those, right? So today it would be foolish to think that there isn't such a clearly identifiable nation. But it is foolish in this sense also to presume, and this is not what the author of the question does, but in general, like to think that there was a moment in which an overarching national, we could say not necessarily even proto-national or proto-identity, but something that we could overlap in great part with today's one, if anything from a geographical point of view, but in this sense being substantiated by something more, by something geistly. For that. Then there is another question, that is to say, if we want to, and it is a matter of spirit. Personally, the more I studied history, the more I realized that I think it's unequivocal that the spirits of today's major, in this case, Western European countries is millennia old. This is not something that was born at some point, I don't know, in the Middle Ages or whatever. The reason why we tend to misthink this is, from one side, the fact that the left said, no, these identities that don't exist because it's dangerous, it's nationalistic, this thing that don't exist, you're a fool, and discrediting that kind of identity. From the other side, also because there were some countries historically that developed much later, truly from, I don't know, some feudal partitions, for example. And I'm not talking the one of the Carolingian War, but literally, if you look at, okay, I don't want to make any specific names, but it's obvious that there are some polities that were truly born in the Middle Ages, because before they did not exist. They had not really had a previous substratum, or they had it, and you could find actually a continuity there too. And this is not the thing, but it's not so glamorous. It's not so evident like in the West in particular. All right, and this question is interesting because when we talk about France, or at least, and again, these three countries as the cornerstone of Western continental Europe, are also very different among one another. But if I were to say, no, Poland, right? Poland is a more recent country, whereas in the ancient world, to an extent, you could already see some more outline pattern of this for this kind of conventionally understood, again, modern country identities, right? You could see at the time. Again, it's not like in Poland there wasn't something that on the basis of which became Polish later. All right, that's not the point I'm making. I'm making the point that certain nationalities, let's now forget Poland, that I used as an example. It could be even at levels of, I don't know. Well, okay, let's not add on the list, but countries that became very nationalistic in the age of nationalism, they had to make up for the fact that they sort of did not exist in a clearly outlined fashion, in or with an equal amount of civilization or cultural output compared to other countries in history, and therefore had to aggressively push for this more technicistic idea of where is a nation born. Hence things like, where do we draw the line? Is it this I don't know, important literary figure, or is this document, the first attestation of this language, and at Similia, right? So let's go by order, right? Where do you place this? So, okay, is Otto the Great, these are also the random questions, is Otto the Great a German ruler or simply a Saxon one? In this sense, the answer is there's definitely a quote-unquote German identity there, all right? And we're not simply talking Germanic. We're not simply talking, again, Saxon. In fact, you also use as an option. It's something overlapping, and there was definitely a German thing, if anything, because already at that point there was an Eastern Frankish kingdom. That is kind of what became Germany, and in that sense also the Eastern Frankish kingdom wasn't born the day before, wasn't even born with the Franks, but there was, for example, this continental chunk of Germanic peoples with the Romans from one side in the west and in the south, and the Slavs in the east, that was in this sense somehow already outlined and self-identifying by a minimum that we don't understand, because we lack the properly, like we haven't interviewed someone who lived at the time to tell us how they actually thought or believed. Much of this, we should also point out, is a matter of estates. All right, I made lots of videos about medieval Germany, and we've seen multiple times how the concept of a quote-unquote Teutonic nation, that literally derived from literally Teuton, the Deutsch, it's exactly what the original etymology of the country would be, also considering the ancient religious ideas of the Germanic tribes. You can argue German already at that point, but it's, again, a matter of approximation. Would have thought of life of the universe, so something also much higher than what the concept of 19th century nation came to be. And that's why I think that that's, in fact, nationalistic and in a fractal sense, like in a post-traditional, in fact, post-universal dimension. In fact, somebody like Otto the Great was not important in a general sense much for the fact that he was German or Saxon, but for the fact that he was a Holy Roman Emperor, and that he reactivated properly a universal empire, which at the time was way more important than the other sort of achievements / identities in that sense. So was Otto the Great a German ruler to a degree? Of course he was. I don't think it can be objected. Just we don't have a calculator that tells us, look, he was like, I don't know, 39% German in his own understanding, or 57% Saxon, or this kind of things, right? And I made videos about, for example, Widukind of Corbeil complaining about the transcendental and metaphysical ethnic romanity of the Saxon emperors for imperial political reasons, ideology, and so on. That's partly addressing the matter. But the question that was posed here is different. That is to say, when was that German identity born? And so in this sense, I immediately tell you that you can't pinpoint a time in which it was born. But there are some conventional ways by which today we say, okay, well, that country was kind of born at this point. Right. If you look at the 9th century, for example, you have the Oaths of Strasbourg, and you have both sides of both armies of the children of Louis the Pious fighting against the third brother. That was based in Italy, for that matter. And you have in the Oath essentially a mutual recognition of each other's sort of quote unquote language. And so you would have a West Frankish is actually a Romance, and another East Frankish, that essentially Germanic language, and you can definitely spot in them the early literary attestation of a fully fledged sort of national language. The 9th century also witnesses, it's something that develops also in the 10th, the 11th brood, maybe was addressing exactly that. But it's already the 9th, monastic centers, big monastic, important monastic centers like St. Gallen, Reichenau, Fulda, etc., starting to use this term Teutonic, which is applied to the Eastern Frankish kingdom, that from there on would become simply the kingdom of Germany, just as the Western Frankish kingdom will actually become the kingdom of France at some point. Can we draw the line there? It's difficult, because when you look, and we'll see now better with France and Italy, that are more, in this sense, older cultures, you can argue. You can't say, in that sense, the French did not exist, the Italians did not exist yet. But the continuity with what would eventually, the cumulation of features that would continue into what we eventually call them French or Italian, which we do for historiographical reasons, and also sort of broader cultural reasons, is not as intense as one of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, that for a longer time, compared to, for example, Gaul and Italy, saw themselves as ethnic duchies, and therefore separated countries to a degree. This is very interesting. I made different videos on the topic, especially I discussed this partially on princely Germany and on other occasions where we observed how essentially there were some parts of Germany was a big country. Other important thing, the Ostsiedlung going on. Ancient Germania Magna was something much more extended east, right? Poland, as we were saying before, was populated by Germanic peoples at large. Then these move and they come mostly in the west. And it's interesting that, by the way, by the settlement, the demographic settlements of the time, that you could simply move as a people and install yourself somewhere else, right? And for those areas of Poland essentially to be Slavicized later, also because, of course, other peoples arrived, but there was also surely a lot of continuity along the way. Then you have the Ostsiedlung further, with the reactivation of the great broader Western Frankish civilization. So from Germany, for actually a millennium, you have up to literally last century some kind of further expansion. And where's the boundary of Germany at that point in the east? There isn't even a boundary of Germany. If we want to set a boundary of what it means to be a German, we should also think, but what is actually in this sense Germany? Because that's what we're talking about. The question is, these people existed, but because we can't fundamentally identify it as an actual country. It's like saying, I don't know, today the Austrians are Austrians. The Austrians are German. They speak, their identity was always German, and just for some specific political reason, they remained also within the broader world balance. They became at some point probably another country on their own. That follows, by the way, partially those ethnic and feudal patterns of the medieval, the German High Middle Ages. So this structure took more time to come together. And in those videos I was talking about before, we see how there were some parts of Germany, especially in the north, that were the least interesting also for any attempt at monarchical recompaction, imperial extension, that at some point lived as if they didn't even care about the fact that there was a king of Germany or an emperor. Which is very interesting because, for example, in France, this was unheard of, and in general, also by the level, for example, of political, civil, statal development, also in Italy, this is unheard of, right? This is Central Europe is a completely different thing from Western Europe. It should be incredibly stressed in many ways. So for Germany, paradoxically, we could give the easier timeline, let's say 9th century, but it's not like being German in that sense by intensity was necessarily more than what we mean today by being French or Italian. And I explain now why. Then you say, I'm pretty sure that William the Conqueror was French by the time of his conquest. Was he? Because in this sense, what do we mean by French? Yes, he spoke essentially the langue du monde. And he definitely belonged to that same regional and in that sense national reality that would become essentially French. But in this sense also, first of all, he was an Austrian, if you want. He was a Norman. He was also different things. Occitania was something slightly different from France. It was sort of added later. Also different other territories of today's France that literally did not even speak Romance in that regard. But in this sense, what do we mean by French? How does our understanding of French identity develop? Really, it essentially develops in a monarchic sense, if not an imperial one. Essentially, it's literally the expansion of the Frankish monarchy, historically, that determines eventually what is going to be French. This is not like the Germans or the Italians that essentially were unified as a people just in the 19th century, politically speaking, but you can't deny that they were already there. Right, with the French, paradoxically, you can sort of very easily identify that sort of polity since Clovis or since, I don't know, the 3rd century AD Romans that literally used for the first time the term Francia, right, to speak of the land of the Franks. With today's polity of France, regardless of all the sort of passages in between. But in that sense, from a national point of view, it's easy. Yes, there is this essentially this Romance pool. That's who the French are, like between the Pyrenees and somewhere up to the Meuse or whatever, the there with the Flemish, the Walloons, like the Romance war ends, except also because of fractal feudal powers, the East was blurred a bit like the East of Germany was blurred, or even more blurred, because as we explained there, also ties were loosened the further east you go in Europe. And in that sense, the overlapping of that French domination over that Atlantic plains populated by Romance people with all their immense sort of demographic and agricultural resources, we come to identify as the French. And in fact, in this sense, it's paradoxically much easier to say what France was by that point, as opposed to Germany was, right, in continuity with our own, and in accordance with our own ex post concept of the two countries, two nations. In this sense, France was more unitary than Germany from an older time, but it also added lots of other chunks of such as Occitania or even Germanic parts of, think about Alsace, just because of further expansion. And so at that point, what is a French, right? If you are an Alsatian, if you're a Pied Noir, namely, I don't know, someone of Alsatian ancestry that, however, speaks French and feels French in Algeria, and feels betrayed by the state of France when they pull out to avoid a Marxist revolution out there. Well, it's that complicated, but that's also the strength of the layers of this political identities, and also the one of the nation state that in France was sort of very strong and arguably even stronger than in Germany, in their own also contrast and conflict, the Furor Gallicus versus Furor Teutonicus. All right. And so the question, but was Hugh Capet French? Well, it's very difficult to answer. Think that just it's in fact during the 10th century that the Western Frankish court stops speaking a Germanic language since the Merovingians, the Carolingians. Also, the title of king of France, probably of Kingdom of France, the Royaume de France, as you know, is an early 13th century thing. It wasn't even properly considered like that. It's a bit like with England, like Kingdom of the English as opposed to Kingdom of England. These, in the sense, who are the English in that context? Because what is that kingdom, and what do we mean by the English? It's not like they didn't exist. Absolutely, this is not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is what kind of layer do we pick, do we prioritize, for also thinking what they did really identify with? That's actually the great question, because we don't really know to the fullest how they saw that matter. Of course, there was a much greater attachment to the local community than to the broader national identity, but you can't even deny that identity really existed. And tendentially, the higher the estate, the more the awareness of belonging to something bigger, because you played bigger and you knew better that that's the way to go if you want to affirm yourself in the world at any point. So that's the thing. So I would say that France also may go with the 10th century, because after all, at that point you have a stabilization. We were talking about Charles the Simple just the other day, where you have a stabilization of a polity that doesn't matter how in the moment sort of scarcely concentrated it is, but will essentially remain recognized as such, and essentially this enormous power will reactivate from the within. I would say that is the actual indicator of what it means to be French. You see, it's not like I'm eager when I'm making, say, a video about this time, say, oh my God, this is the word French, this is the word Germans. No, I would use the term Western Frankish, Eastern Frankish, for example. I think it's more nuanced, because I want to, with history, you are always using a particular narrative, right? And in that instance, I would like to make people reflect on what it meant, for example, that somebody would, as we were saying the other day's video with Charles the Simple, that, I don't know, the Germans themselves would, you see, I use German here, use the term to contrast with the Rex Francorum title up until essentially the Salians. The Ottonians did that because there was a sense that royal power, the Eastern Frankish one, was deeply connected with the older one of Charlemagne, of that kind of empire as well. And so you see how, and it's not, again, we know like what a 10th century peasant in Thuringia really believed. probably he didn't even see much this idea of a German identity. Probably that in goal, like the French identity was in that sense more vivid, more kind of obvious, and not even because the Germans were so different as the French necessarily, but because they didn't see at their level of political and societal development a necessity or an obvious reason for which they would be a wall as opposed to a sum of people that, as it was also tradition, identified a sole ruler for the sake of necessity and defending their pre-existing rights. This is a concept of common law that actually at the time was pretty much alive everywhere, regardless of the fact that, like in France, like also by the later revival of Roman law, there was an idea that had to be, for example, a common law really imposed on any community by the sake just of fluidifying administration, stepping up in a subtle sense, becoming more powerful, right? And at that point, this is very interesting because it also shows you that, as we're making the case before between the Italics and the Greeks, that a broader community does not necessarily mean that you are more diluted in power or less effective or necessarily less military. It's not directly proportional, right? Then you say the same question applies to the Italians. Does it start with Dante and his contemporaries, like the earlier time? No, well, it starts definitely earlier. This is an interesting question. I mean, the detail, the fact that you would choose Dante, it sounds more like here you don't touch much on linguistic issues with Dante, maybe because you're sort of identifying a literary figure as that moment. Dante makes of Italian a fully literary language. That's the watershed, but Italian already existed as a language from, outlined sense from a couple of centuries. There are already texts from the 11th century that basically we say this is not Latin anymore. This is something else, right? And we don't even know in between how this changed. We have sort of very scanty evidence of that kind. The problem here is understanding what it means to be Italian for them. And with Italy, the thing gets even more interesting because you have also by 19th century standards and this kind of racialistic, rivalries, people still today having a difficult time coping with how, history in general went in many ways. This idea that, for example, Italy is hopelessly divided and different and unequal, and that it's a sort of not necessarily made up country or whatever, but it's something that where differences are exasperated in a sense. This is actually one of the greatest fictions in post-traditional history, and mostly it's a pop myth. It's something created out of a racialistic, nationalistic, competitive, aggressive mentality to smear people. This happened also for other populations. I mean, if you start talking about the Balkans or other, realities, this happens all the time. You still have people who literally, even for the French not so much, but for the Germans, I still do things like, I don't know, you can't use the term German, or you have to use the term Turkic instead of Turk, because otherwise people think that you're talking that there was Turkey in, I don't know, at the time of the Seljuks. I mean, in academia, that's, everybody uses the term German, right? If you want to use the term German for the time of Augustus, you can definitely do it. It's not a mistake. And the reason why these incidents, so to say, happen is that people who make this kind of criticism have literally no clue about this layer. They reason as if just nation exists when country unified. Nation exists when, I don't know, it's modern times, it's not whatever it was in antiquity. It doesn't kind of work like that. As for the Italians, the paradox is interesting because Italians lived in a country, first of all, that was overwhelmingly advanced, right? This is something that's being removed from most historical pop culture. The level of development of the Italian peninsula after the Roman Empire was incredibly high, right? Italy was the richest country per capita uninterruptedly, even throughout the migration era from Roman times to the late 17th century. I mean, still today, Italians are richer than the Germans and the Swedes per capita. And yet, nobody understands that this is something where people have strange ideas of why this is the case. but that this is obviously a lot to do with the Roman Empire. If you have an idea of not just the Roman Empire, like Rome with gladiators and the lions and all the rest of the provinces subjugated, but if you have an idea of the radical advancement of the Italian peninsula, the radical overpopulation, the radical urbanization of the Italian peninsula, the radical size of the Italian population, 1/4 of Europe in the 13th century was Italian, right? If you have a minimal figure, what this means in a comprehensive European sense, you immediately realize just by dialectically that this system was unequivocally self-identifiable. And it was so since the very early Middle Ages. The Italians were so developed that they fragmented, as you know, in city-states that were capable essentially of being actual states, unlike other cities in the rest of Europe, and territorially conquering other cities, creating states on their own, and so on. And in this sense, rooting dramatically for an identity that was different in that overarching fashion, 30 kilometers away from another city that had a different identity in that regard. And yet these people spoke the same identical language. If you read Italian chronicles from the High Middle Ages, the later, say the 13th century, so Dante's time, where you have much more vernacular, that comes later because these guys were tendentially also more educated, so Latin did well as a literary language, even when people already spoke Italian, because they were that educated. It has nothing to do in that sense, in fact, with a later development of Italian identity. It was arguably much earlier than these other countries we describe now. You realize that it's in fact the same identical language that people who had never up to the few generations before written in vernacular, and therefore had problems, for example, in deciding how to standardize this language because they didn't know how to render a specific sound, right, wrote in the same identical language, right? And this is so macroscopical that it really makes you wonder how or why people think that, for example, Italy is so overwhelmingly different. Say, pick Piedmontese and Sicilian, very different languages. There is no doubt. They're actually the same language. I mean, it's not like Languedoc and Languedoc. They're literally, by scale, two sort of different regional national languages. The Italian peninsula had a level of linguistic homogeneity that is virtually unknown to most countries in Europe. If you pick, I don't know, the UK with the English and the Celts, with Spain that had the Arabs, with the same France we listed now. Germany is pretty cohesive, but again, its differences were in that sense more different. Like, it's really difficult to understand Dutch if you are not if you are a Carinthian, all right? So there is no doubt, the saying goes, if you're a Sicilian compared to a Venetian. But at the same time, the same level of literary production, the same level of state building, of administration, of armies, as we see, that Italy was something incredible in that sense. And so the false lens, the sort of the fractal effect of this is that it seems as if, since they were all different states, that for some reason they were different from one another. They were actually the same. You've seen it very often also in the comment. This is especially pronounced in central and northern Italy, but also because we have just more coming from there. This is largely valid for the south, and that communes in all this 30 cities developing, you would imagine all in a different way, right? They all had the same reforms, even though they didn't control each other, in the same exact decades. And they went on in the same identical way because they were all interconnected to an incredible level of economical, cultural. Again, also think about the Great Leagues, military, that these were able to defeat the same Holy Roman Emperor. So when you look at the early Middle Ages, you have a Longobard kingdom that sort of impressed that level of Italian uniformity. It's, after all, just a couple of hundred years later, or even less actually, than the fall of the West. where Italy was essentially a wall. Yes, there was the Italia annonaria, the suburbicaria. There were some few differences. For example, the Po Valley was much less connected with the rest. There were some parts of Italy in late antiquity that were much more close to Gaul than they were to the Po Valley. However, with the Longobards in particular, that stiffen a bit the north as well and conquer a great part of the peninsula, you realize that there is a great deal of actual political cohesiveness. Other enormous myth in historiography is that the Longobards were all fractally divided in dukedom. This is completely false, right? Longobard Italy was way more cohesive than the Visigothic Spain, Frankish Gaul, and in this sense, literally anything that existed in the West. I made multiple videos on Longobard history that explains that. And so already at that point, you have the Franks, the Arabs, calling whoever lived in Italy by approximation a Lombard. All right, this is something that continues in the later Middle Ages, and it's quite fascinating because while, for example, I don't know, in Dante's time, where the Italians had banks, branches scattered all over Europe, and you had, I don't know, the Milanese merchant, and then the Piacentine merchant, and the Florentine merchant, all these things. When these people were abroad, they called themselves, and they were called by others, essentially Italian or Lombards. And when they were home, they actually were cats and dogs with one another, but essentially for political reasons, not because they didn't understand each other or they were different or whatever. So actually, I would say that a sort of a clearly identifiable Italian identity is already undeniable in a cohesive sense by the time of Charlemagne. So let's say the late Longobard era, when those sacks of Byzantine were, but also the Byzantines, the peoples living in the people living in the Byzantine part of Italy were very similar to the ones living in the part of controlled by the Longobards. And so you always have this sense that since politically and entirely something is separated, that culturally they're not similar to one another. This is the great weird thing that happens with Italian identity. And in that sense, I think that already with the Longobards, we can appreciate the fact that it was an internationally recognized Italian identity, and that even though this did vary within, it was perspectively perhaps distancing, taking too many distances from the within, only to stress the fact that this was a much more interconnected system that had the possibility of having different centers of power competing with one another within the same, again, system again. So this is my take on it. Then when an Italian identity developed, hell, like it's just like for the Germans, there are people who would say, well, there were Germans or Italians who were opposed to their own unification in the 19th century. So what we do, we don't consider those Italian because, I don't know, they wanted to make the point that in that specific moment in history, the unification of their countries was a divisive concept that had to be countered by another identity, right? It doesn't quite make sense when you, I don't know, read a Renaissance work by, I don't know, some Calabrese aristocrat that is writing just like Petrarch wrote in the 14th century, because that was how Italian culture with capital C, because Italian was the language of modern Europe during the Renaissance, self-evidently, actually disproves the notion that this was, but the peasant there and that did not understand that he spoke a completely different way. Well, this is then he not just did not speak a completely different thing, but it's just a point you can make for any at that point political stand against unification. It's not like, I don't know, people in Poland or in Hungary or even in Britain or in Spain had a more thrilled unitary feeling towards their own kingdoms. At that point, the problem is that you can't even ask those, because in the West we have largely, and also in just some parts of the West, much better documentation than in others. And if the other places are silent, that's really not much of a good sign of overall intertwinement and compaction. So I would like to leave this point of reflection, because otherwise we take countries as something drawn on the map. We are taking away millennia of cultural stratification that becomes ever more cohesive and ever more, in that sense, identifiable. Right? I think that there isn't much you can say against it. Like, I don't know, the same linguistic roots of these peoples, in a way, were that. I mean, Gallic is Gallic, Italic is Italic. That's something that existed from antiquity. There was an Italian known in Augustan times. There was extended also to the Gallo-Italics of the north, were essentially Celticized populations, eventually Italicized by Roman colonization. That also had a Villanovian society. It was, in that sense, already, you can say Italian since that point. So actually, we should, I think, respect much more the history of European countries for how deep it is, and recognize, in that sense, in comparison, say how difficult it was instead for other parts, not just of the world, but also within the same Europe, when we give for granted a national identity, because to us it's just like, I don't know, a meme or whatever we think we want it to be. History is not really an opinion, and it's interesting when you are able to have an explanation for everything you see, rather than simply wondering why that is the case. But I guess that the Q&A series is designed exactly for this purpose. Obviously, we could go on and on and on, because again, with France, Germany, Italy, etc., basically the channel is dedicated to these three countries. No, well, I'm joking, but in general, like, it obviously, like, our deeper, and you understand how different these countries, by the way, are. They all have a different history, right? There are two Western countries, one Central European country, yet we are, think about since Carolingian times, or the European Union, all what we kind of understand of Europe starts paradigmatically from these countries, including before we talk about William the Conqueror and so on. Like, there is a truly imperial Catholic traditional centrality to these countries in European and world history that is objectively scary, and we could go on and on and on with all this. Finally, there is actually a terrifying question. I don't want the author of this question to feel bad about it, so I will actually make a warning in case he listens to this. I'm not sure whether I'm going to send the links privately to these people back, but I will say this: I will not take an antagonistic stance against this question. However, I will be quite blunt, and I think it's actually an important question, and I'm glad that it was asked, because it expresses, it's a beautiful question. It would have, for, again, each of them, I should have dedicated an entire video to them, because this is very important. All right, I will take some time for this in the end as well. This reflects today's youth's disorientation. I wouldn't say like it's ignorance or malignity, or it's just, I don't know, some other attribution of lack of understanding. It is to the extent that we all passed at some point through these stages, and it's completely normal to be alien, unfortunately, at this time in history from tradition. So I don't know whether this person has already written me somewhere, because I get somehow similar questions. Last spring, I made a video about Serbia. There are also apparently Serbians who ask me for this kind of questions, and there is something that I recognize here from a post-socialist background that I had to cope with on multiple occasions in my life, and that is that in a sense comforts me regarding the fact that the least things are understood, at least the more easily they can be led to some specific issues, right? It's much more difficult to be a successful civilization in that truly imperial and universal sense than fixing actually what is what is not working elsewhere, right? So also for the author of the question and anybody else, if you're interested in this discourse further, I tell you, it's again, you find it in the Q&A playlist. The title was question and answer number 42. Is it morally permissible to exploit corruption in post-communist Serbia as a believer? Which is pretty dense. Here I realize, yes, it's not the same author for a very specific reasons we will learn now, because the guy claims to be a pagan, as a matter of fact. So we will here do our inquisitory job as no, but seriously, and it's a very interesting question, telling the truth. So it says, Dear Schwerpunkt, everybody starts with saying, Dear Schwerpunkt. Kind of weird. I'm a young student of philology from Serbia. Philosophy, thank God. Well, better than philology. I was about to get an heart attack. And even, I would have gotten cold blood heart attack if I had just simply read philosophy. I read philology, and that's sort of outscales everything. So philosophy, you're partially forgiven for having studied philosophy. I don't even know, honestly, people who study philosophy in Serbia how it is, but I presume it's not this terrific path. I would have never been able to study philosophy to begin with. And I understand that you're young. I understand how young you are. Here, I think he even tells me how old he is. No, something like, well, okay. I presume he's in his early 20s or something, because the way you write in your early 20s looks like this. And it not as an insult, right? This is literally how an early 20-year-old brain works. And this beliefs correspond to that specific stage. And we will see now how and why. And I came across your channel, he says, a few years ago, interestingly enough, when the algorithm recommended to me a few of your most popular videos regarding the migration period of the late Antiquity and early Middle Ages. I watched a few of them and found them to be informative, but that's when I've stopped for a while. Till recently, another video was recommended to me, which was such interest to me that it prompted me to check out your channel. Well, actually, two videos were the ones that really made me dive deep into it. The first one was a response to a question posted by a Serbian theology student. So yeah, it's actually, I forgot because I read this email just time ago. I haven't reread it to now, but yeah, the guy acknowledges they had responded to the article. So good, right? I hadn't to tell you to check that, but others may wanna do so. Serbian theology student in Russia, if I remember correctly. Yes, if I remember correctly now, Schwerpunkt, he actually had gone to Russia and he was disgusted by it, and he came back to Serbia. He said that Russia was terribly anti-traditional and broken and null, basically, and yeah, if I remember correctly. And the second was your review of the many history channels of YouTube. So, but yeah, those videos were close to one another. But is it possible you watched the worst content of me? Now, those were interesting videos, I admit it, but for some reason YouTube overtly promotes them as opposed to the history content that is actually much better and much more interesting. And actually, this is a point that I would like to convey in my question and answer videos, is that if you have a question about my work, it doesn't simply get to things like I may have covered the stuff specifically. If you're asking history or even some of my sort of worldview that you can find in those if you search, it's the fact that in every video, and obviously I mostly make history ones, the way I explain things derives from that, or better, history itself tells me that. So if you listen to what I'm saying in those videos, you can come to understand the rest. This is a problem that people have had forever with my channel. On Reddit, people say, oh my God, what's his ideology? We don't know. What. Yeah, because if you don't study things, it happens, just surprise, not to understand them. And that's actually instead what my channel is about. It may be weird and difficult to follow and whatever, but it actually does provide you with all you need to understand this. So this guy says, I agreed almost completely on the way you see other history channels. And it was also interesting to me that you touch a bit on the protests and climate in Serbia and other here he writes TH, then comment and post-socialist countries. I don't know, this might have been a mistype. Post-socialist countries, that it made me dig deeper. Yes, I'm probably going to make more videos about those in contemporary history, obviously. And I was doing so, he says. I began to watch videos on medieval Serbia, which had a lot of information that, besides your channel, I've only ever heard from historians and students of history here in Serbia. Information that, while not necessarily niche, is mostly found in the books and is severely lacking on YouTube. Well, I'm glad that you found my medieval Serbian history content, and this can really help you understand a lot of what you're about to ask. I'm telling you, and I explained better why later. He says, then I have noticed that you use terminology, and this is the point of my question, that is very unfamiliar to me, and I've only ever found it on your channel and never yet found a video where it was explained more thoroughly. I'm of course talking about terms such as Fourth Estate, Imperial Catholic Tradition, Uranic and Heavenly, Indo-European versus Telluric and Tonic Pelasgian, right? Now, I think I somewhat understand the latter distinction, but what really bugs me is the understanding of what the Fourth Estate and the Imperial Catholic tradition actually mean, because searching for it online didn't seem to provide a substantial result. Well, I'm surprised, because I had, by the way, and now maybe I understand who you are, because I noticed that in the comments recently there was someone asking what the Fourth Estate is. Actually, you're not the first person doing so, and I think somebody answered to that. And I understand that you don't find Imperial Catholic tradition online. It's totally normal. But Fourth Estate is really easy. All right, if you look at, it is true that I still haven't made a video about the Fourth Estate as such, also for the obvious reasons that we'll understand now. But I'm going to, still within, however, the traditional doctrine of the castes. As far as Imperial Catholic tradition, I have a pretty big playlist on that. And let's say that in almost every video, I literally explain what it is, right? But I will explain it now again for you. Then Uranic and Heavenly, Indo-European versus Telluric, Tonic, Pelasgian. Okay, you can understand that. Now, the concept of Imperial Catholic tradition, start from this because it's the most important. So the notion of Imperial Catholic tradition is the fact that originally, like if you look at tradition, that I try to expound on this channel in ways that really the sources do for me, right? The entire point of humanity is to win over death, and this occurs by transfiguring the world, yourself and the world in the process. That is to say, everything that fell with the sin of man, and so falling from divinity, cracking the celestial vault and materializing the world, and as a consequence of our own fault that is continuous. It's not like it happened, it's all Adam and Eve's fault, or whoever you think it was, and we have to live with that. No, we are actively sinning to the point that if we weren't, we would be able to return to divinity, right? And I made multiple videos on the doctrine of the two natures, being and becoming, the notion that essentially, and this is actually very difficult to explain, and I will actually have made a video about that. It's not figurative as much as it's beyond our comprehension. I mean, and explaining that would be, definitionally, would be to be God ourselves. It's like answering to the question whether God exists or not. That's not something you can demonstrate, because the reason why you're human and immortal prevents you to fully do that, right? In any case, the idea of tradition is one of wisdom, essentially, that is passed down, literally, through the eras, as if anything, the awareness of the fact that inverting the fall is possible. And tradition explains how this is done. All the main religions, I mean, historically, one another carry tradition within them, and there are some that did better, some worse. There is, in my opinion, like a centrality of the West in the achievement of this power that literally manifests through earthly power as well. I don't want to complicate ideas too much, but I'll make people very aware of this, because there are people who think that I'm a globalist because I stress the necessity of imperial Catholic tradition. And this ties very much in what you're about to say later, and then we'll explain much better. But the notion is that if you have the power to transfigure the world, you have the power to dominate the world entirely, right? And this is clearly the point of all ancient civilizations, the achievement of divinity, the restoration of the golden age on earth, that is to say, making everything come back to the great one. The reason why this is called Catholic, imperial is obvious, even though the term is not obvious, especially if you aren't aware of the fact that the imperium is the Holy Ghost, right? But Catholic stems literally from the Greek kataolon, which means, and that we came to know better through mostly the Christian language, that we think is just a Christian thing, and that is actually predating Christianity, and or at least it is shared by all of these cultures, which means through everything, right? Kata, Greek, these prepositions can mean tons of things, but they are also semantically retaining that wealth of the original Indo-European language means literally through the wall, all on, from also with holistic, like the idea that the Holy Ghost as the divine grace based on virtue, on works, makes you able to take over the world, and so to pass through the wall and to reunite everything is exactly the meaning of Catholic, and it's deeply transfigurational. It has to do with achieving immortality and more, right? And this is the entire purpose of tradition. Many people do not know what Catholic means. They literally think they're so ignorant. People today, in general, so radically undereducated and completely oblivious of what tradition is about, that they think that Catholic is just like an option as opposed to Protestant or whatever. Like it's just like a church, like a school, a view of seeing this, a strange way they decided to do things at a point. Catholic, by the way, since you're Serbian, is also the official name of the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church's name is Catholic because it cannot be stripped away from the Christian foundation of it all. Actually, if you go to a Catholic priest, one of the few things that they actually still know about tradition is that Catholicism predates Christianity. This is really, it's part of the magisterium of the church. Like the idea that everything that had to come to the Son achieving through the Holy Ghost divinity is exactly this pre-existing frame and struggle that tradition expounds, right? I will not digress on how different peoples, of course, understood that they had all different heroes who had achieved that, right? If you look at Mithras, if you look at Hercules, if you look at Romulus, they all achieved this immortality. And for a providential purpose that is not immediately evident, and especially to humanity. Hence the doctrine of the two natures that basically says that the higher nature is immanent, right? It's not merely, it's not really a bidimensional situation where you have to go to heaven like the sky. It's literally the fact that we live sleeping, without slumbering, without understanding that there is an awakening that at that point makes he who achieves that transcend everything that we actually see around us. That is just our own creation of darkness for us to remain in the slumber. Providence means the capacity of seeing the future. That's what the Latins meant by that, provideo, which means to see, to foresee, right? And that is like the eye of Ra. It's basically the idea that if you have a divine will, you will literally mold the world at your own image, say how Alexander did by conquering the world, all right? In achieving divinity. Augustus was literally a person that when going to Alexandria and looking at Alexander's sepulchre, he was, he was told by one of his, officers, do you want to go look at the tomb of Ptolemy? Augustus responded, he was not yet Augustus, but you understand what I mean? No, because I'm here to see the living, not the dead, right? Augustus, the founder of what we call again the Roman Empire, though the empire already existed because it's the sacrament, it's the imperium, right? The Holy Ghost literally believed in the fact that the imperial Catholic tradition was there, and that he also was embracing that by taking over this immense power. And the Golden Age, I just recently made a video about the Virgilian sense, probably the restoration of the Indo-European heaven according to that tradition. So in this sense, the meaning of imperial Catholic tradition is readily evident. It may sound confusing if you have never heard of that, but basically, in front of this, any other possible ideology dies, right? There isn't any other option. Any other ideology that ever sprang except this is a form of self-sabotage, of misunderstanding, of delusion, right? And the reason why people know nothing about this is, first of all, the fact that they're becoming atheistic, that they have never really understood from centuries in the masses after the ancien regime what this thing really literally what it meant, right? If you look at pre-ancien regime art, you realize there were, I don't know, Olympian figures everywhere. Why do you think that was the case? We have been literally deprived of an actual education that is informing us about the fact that the entire history of the world revolved around this universal belief that all religions, I was about to say, but religion is not even the right term, revolves around, it is a distillate of tradition, is the way every people sort of posed itself towards this. There are huge differences within it. But the simple reason people do not study anything, I arrived to this actually through military history. I arrived this from Clausewitz, and then religious history, I had also a background to that, but in general, I discovered the things all by myself. I don't know any person who specifically explains what I'm explaining. We're explaining to you now, because there are people who absolutely studied this in part, right, but came to very strange conclusions and or lost themselves in translation, so to say. But the absolute principle, I'm increasingly polishing in a way that I think no other person has ever touched upon. In this sense, I think that Uranic, heavenly, Indo-European, Telluric, Chthonic, Pelasgian, you can find by yourself in understanding what it actually really means. Fourth estate in the doctrine of castes is simply the lowest caste. And so actually the non-beings, according to tradition, may sound brutal and terrible, but it's actually literally how it is. I mean, while you are being provided with a nobiliar power, like freedom, that's at least freedom is a dangerous word, because only God is free theologically. Only if you are God yourself, if you partake divinity, you are free, and to that extent. Because the idea is that if your soul manages to go to heaven to make things simple, you will partake part of divinity, and you will have from the superior nature a capacity to help providentially the nether world. In this sense, in life, people are unequal, and they are essentially represented in what the Marxists would call the classes, that they understand as rigid, as deterministic, because they are doomers, they are materialists. Whereas this was the traditional doctrine of the castes that was highly spiritual in concept, and essentially the fourth estaters there are many ways you could describe them. Essentially, they are the people whose ancestors did not achieve heaven. And so basically can just be saved by others. Or at least they could save themselves, because the estates could be surpassed, but they largely, because they are fourth estaters, do not make it. For example, in India, the pariahs, and so the fourth estate at that point is literally the non-beings, while the other three estates represent essentially the Indo-European freemen, right, that are subordinated to one another, because they're not really free. The Romans had a beautiful word for that, liberty, as opposed to freedom, because if you're not God, you can't be fully free. And so you're basically always subordinated to God or to all those leaders that basically succeed more than you, and that you sort of elevate yourself in the wake on if you are able to respond to the call. And so the fourth estates were literally non-being, were pure evil, death. they were impure. We talked about this recently also in the videos about the Vedas. I created also a playlist about them, so if you're interested. But again, we will talk more about the doctrine of the cases to explain this better. The Iranians apparently didn't even have a fourth estate, because, at least conceptually, because they were a more feudal society. They had less people to subjugate like in India, and so they basically didn't even recognize the existence of a fourth estate, even though they had it. It would be the plebs in Rome, and so all those people were not really free. And there are different echelons to this, right? For example, the Nibelungs are the dwarves, according to the Germanic mythology, compared to the Asen. And so to the divine stock, actually, whereas in a more human sense, the Nibelungs are actually the Burgundians. They're actual heroes among them, and also they have their own slaves and serfs that are, by human standards, the fourth estate. All right, so this shows you how everything is actually relative to only to God. Like in absolute terms, that's the measure you should have. As I was saying before, and so the fourth estate, more conventionally, unfortunately, in the Marxianized language of our generations, from quite a while, would be just the how do you call them, the workers, right? People who work in the they're the scum of society, the blue collar jobs of this kind of thing, like those who can't afford to be greater than what they are, because they do not know how to enact the spirit, and so they stop to matter. In fact, that's also what Marxism is all about, right? Is trying to destroy the rest of the estates, namely, as you know, the depending on also in the times, the first estate is more conventionally understood to be the church, but initially was supposed to be the warrior class. In fact, the church warriors, and essentially the third estate is the bourgeoisie. And so this would be the workers in a broader sense, but still as people who are free. And naturally, there is a quality in this hierarchy, all right? And the fourth estate are probably lesser people, and so they are those who really can't make it. And so it's not, say, today people would say, but you're classist, you hate the poor. Not quite, because tradition does not actually imply that you can't be powerful if you are poor. It has nothing to do with the doctrine of the cases. It actually has to do it in part, but it's not everything. I personally have a family history that sort of showed me that in a way, and that's just a part of my family. I have also aristocratic ancestry, but let's say there have been things that my fourth estaters ancestors showed and achieved that also made them, elevated, and then at least third estaters that, frankly, have elevated them more than other members who were able to do in their life from the upper estate. So actually, I have an enormous respect for everyone as far as that is concerned, but I don't condone anyone who relishes in a level of inferiority and is just using that as an excuse, as a superstition in everything. So this is the little answer of what these terms really mean. Again, fourth estate you can easily find online. Just go on Wikipedia and see what a fourth estate actually is. Of course, you will not get my answer of the cases, because whoever wrote that article was likely a Marxist or someone who was trying to make you to make the fourth estate look cool, and better. These are the guys who fight for rights and freedom. This is a pile of BS, right? And we can talk about this further in other circumstances. Excuse me, I drink a little. So the question goes on. It says, now I think I somewhat understand a lot. Okay, we already read this. If it might be of help, I will tell you that my political... Okay, this is where things get dark in this question, and I will explain you why also under the light of what I just explained. I will tell you, this is what he says, that my political background is nationalistic and socialistic. Well, yeah, great choice. It says, in parentheses, socialistic only partially, as I really don't have anything. No, excuse me, I don't know anything. This is in cap locks. I don't know anything about economy enough to really pick my side on how it should be run. So that's not really a good, let's say, situation to start from, calling yourself whatever you want to call yourself. And it says, and unlike the majority of Serbs, especially nationalistic ones, I'm a pagan, which has inevitably led me to being ostracized from being a part of the various nationalistic circles. So, little guide, I will not now go too harsh on this. I will just say two things. So you're a Nazi, basically, could be, right? Because if you're saying you're nationalistic or socialistic, well, are you a national socialist? If you really wanted to to give you an explanation, you should actually answer that. Also because that's what a man does, right? Secondly, anything that ends in ism is not really a good thing. That's why tradition is something, but traditionalism, especially when you misunderstand tradition and you call yourself like that, or universalism, but in the sense you don't know exactly what things should be universal, but it's just an overemphasis of something that shouldn't be emphasized. Nation and society are part of tradition, and they must be sublimated in ways that tradition is quite clear about in a metaphysical, transcendental, spiritual fashion. So it's great to support your nation. It's great to support your society. But being a nationalist and a socialist is not a good thing, because these are ideologies that were essentially affirmed as such after traditional nation, after traditional society. This is red terrorist, fourth estate, lesser peoples, post-traditional, anti-elite ideology from the 19th century. Right, this is the filth of the fourth estate telling lesser people that they are okay just the way they are if you stamp a brand on them, such as this terminology, even though they don't even know what the hell they even mean, so that they can act as if they could sort of deflect the attention from the fact that they are lesser people. Being a lesser person is never an excuse for being a lesser person, right? If you're mortal, if you're human means dirty, because in Latin, humus means specifically dirty, but in the negative sense of the dirt. So it basically means shit. And if you still are there and you're doing nothing to transfigure the world to save everybody into divinity, you are substituting nationalism and socialism for actual tradition as any other thing. It can be paganism, it can be communism, it can be whatever the hell it is, right? Other explanation, pagan, I don't know what, it's maybe even better to call yourself a socialist than call yourself a pagan. Pagan is the most fractally inferior level of society, right? Pagan is a term that even if you are, I know that neo-pagans and all this bullshit, like they think actually that they are re-embracing the cult, the myth, that without understanding anything about history of religion or what those people really believed. First of all, I never actually met a so-called neo-pagan that wasn't basically mentally disturbed person who had been traumatized by lesser people's misunderstanding of Christianity imposed on them and making their own identity, being resentful about being lesser people as a consequence and blaming others, namely Christianity, for that. But secondly, the term, right? Aside from the fact that only a person that lives in the 21st century would be probably put down by their ancestors. I mean, if you think that your ancestors in quote-unquote pagan times, which were not pagan times, believed that you were a worthy human being for life, well, I would very much slow down by any social, cultural, or individual anthropological sense, right? Because those people lived in ways that you have no idea they did. And pagan to them was an insult because you were equating them to the lesser villagers, the filthiest fourth estate, the dirty little, person were a farmer, a peasant, a slave, a serf lived to believe in the dirt and its cultistic materialism, idolatry, while the great lords lived looking with their heart at heaven and the sky, looked at earth as the literal incarnation of the filth of mankind because of its disgusting sin, right? So being a pagan is a term that obviously was slammed by the Christians on the previous Catholic believers, in tradition that had their reasons to mistrust Christianity, and that, however, were also the same reason why they gave way to it, because Christianity is trying to fix what had just really happened, namely the failure of the great Catholic Empire. All the peoples around were no better. They had already stopped believing, even before the Romans, that they could save themselves by their own actions. Only the great rulers do so. And in fact, paganism, today's paganism, neo-paganism, is exactly the complete reversal and misunderstanding of this. Right? It's the notion that if you salvage your own nationalistic identity, you're basically saving yourself, where you understand that the only way you have to save yourself in a sea of nations, of a sea of immigrants, of whatever is changing, because you're too weak to fix it, is divinity. Right? And so being a pagan is like being trying to be, I don't know, someone who believes in tradition and calling yourself a communist. It's just the most idiotic thing. It's I don't know. It's I can't find, I don't know, a better punching line, but it's literally the diametrical opposite brand that you want to call yourself. Now, I know that neo-pagans to an extent called themselves heathens or other stuff, but they also, I never really met one of them who actually understood anything of what I just said, or that actually didn't have such an attitude like, I don't know, there was such a thing like, I don't know, Norse paganism that was something different from other paganism, especially within a European context and within the imperial Catholic traditional context, that they had any clue whatsoever. I talk about basic education, like the first manuals of in history of religion classes in the first year of a normal Western European standard of university education, like zero. Like, these people are radically undereducated. They have no idea what they're talking about. The only thing they do is whining about Christianity all the time. And actually, in my experience with post-socialists, I realized that basically post-socialists' hatred, in particular towards Christianity, is a complete communistic brainwash that was inculcated in the fourth estate lesser people during communism. The idea that everything was the fault of the church because the church had the money and lesser people didn't have the money, so let's steal them, right? It's just like today's thing against the Jews. Like, it's not like people are even understand that, for example, Christianity literally says that the Jews must be preserved for the end of time, because we need a witness to show that the Christians were right in front of God. As in the Middle Ages, where Jews were firmly protected by bishops, by princes, by the nobility, against the fourth estate that tried to steal their money. The fourth estate only cares about material. And that's basically it. It's just like today, neo-paganism. It's basically either a passive-aggressive kind of psychiatric issue towards Christianity, or whatever, actually copying it at the end of the day, because they largely don't have any clue about what a religion is supposed to be, or what it shouldn't be, for that matter. Or it's just a mask for neo-Nazism. And this is because the notion is that, again, if you fixate with your own country instead of wanting to take over the entire world, you will surely succeed, even though the phenomena where we realize this, the fact that these movements are more present are exactly the countries that are being overrun by immigrants. You understand how weak and so how anti-traditional this idea is, because in tradition, if you have the imperium, if you have the Holy Ghost, you win. You take over everything, right? And the fact that people start to, alienate themselves from reality, cultivating their own self-hatred for the fact that they are collapsing, and they think that for some reason their own race will prevail without doing anything else, by this sort of passive-aggressive lamentation against somebody else's fault, is just places them far below even fourth estaters of antiquity and what they think, again, it was kind of paganism. And so in Serbia, at least I appreciate, of course, that nationalists are Orthodox largely, even though, of course, largely full of pretty shitty ideas in what is left of their brain. I am far beyond ultra far right wing, as far as if you were to calculate me on a political compass. But again, I don't need to behave essentially as the animals that their own ideology represents, because at that point, if you believe that mere incarnation is, and so including racial phenotypes are the measure of some alleged success. First of all, nobody explains why you're going under. Secondly, that's basically zoological determinism. You're basically thinking that you're going to succeed, but you're not succeeding. How does it work? Denying transcendence, denying the ABC of literally like sublimating your being into something that transcends race, that you're obviously not able to achieve. I'm saying you talking to those kind of beings, right? Not much the fact that, any of them is even understanding what I'm even supposed to be talking about. But that's exactly the point. These ideologies have nothing to do with any trace of tradition. They're just essentially what the mentally fragile today, especially young people without identity, without education, without parenting, without, of course, any trace of tradition, believe that by joining like sheep, the group like will save them, will actually make them sink and irreversibly damaged, injured in the process without any possibility of coming back. If one in his early 20s is considering himself a pagan, these are issues that should have fixed at the very latest, by when you are 16 years old. So I don't know you personally, and maybe there is some good in it, but only the fact that you're coming to me saying these things, as if calling oneself a nationalist, socialist, and a pagan was something, to be announced to the world. I think that it's going to be very difficult to fix things by this point. But the point of tradition is that you can always be saved, right? You don't have to do it through somebody else. You have to do it through yourself. The idea also of Catholicism is that you must be within a spiritual body, and that therefore there is a preferential path to that. It's very difficult to do it alone, but it doesn't mean that in absolute terms you can't do it alone. It's just like the easiest or the properest, at least, way. It's actually the hardest, in fact, and it requires this because of the aforementioned difference between liberty and freedom. All right. So this was the bad part of the message. I don't know if later things actually go worse, but I wanted to be extremely precise about this all, right? Paganism, in the way it's manifesting, socially speaking, at this point, is not tradition. I don't doubt that there are people out there who maybe identify themselves as pagan, but they have maybe a grasp of tradition in the sense of what I'm talking about. But again, if you don't have a massive expertise or at least a great deal of work in history of religion, in Indo-European stakes, and also in just basic history, so a good dose of political, strategical, moral compass, it's really very difficult to go anywhere. Philosophy is not going to do it alone. Philosophy is largely studying somebody else's ideas, mostly from post-traditional realities and or taught in ways that have nothing to do with the original spirit of the thing. And again, it's terrible. I could never study philosophy. I don't really advise it to anyone, even though I actually really liked philosophy when I studied it in the past, both lots of years actually in school and university, but because it made me understand that that cultural necessity, knowing, if anything, philosophy, is exactly instrumental in understanding how to reject it, and to reject especially the way in which we have been taught it. So, as I said at the beginning, I've been very blunt and harsh even, but this is exactly the only way one could possibly address this. The question goes on and says, not really caring much about it, as I'm also very distrustful of the masses, and I see you are as well. I treated it first as a curse, but then as a blessing in disguise. However, I don't understand what exactly. The fact you're a pagan, I don't know. That being beside the point here, I'm very curious about the evangelization. Okay, this is a good thing, where you talked about how there was practically no difference between paganism and of old in Christianity that came to replace it. In a sense, you describe it as not really replacing, but rather reforming the old religion and ridding it of the chthonic and Pelagian enemies, from what I understand it. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So it's not quite the same thing, unfortunately, in the sense that, as I was hinting at before, Christianity came about in a moment in which people literally collapsed. all right? And Christianity attempted to reform it, essentially came around as a spiritual approach to the Catholic tradition by basically saying, look, this is the condition you are yourself in, right? Here, I don't want to digress. I mean, it may seem strange in this context on Christology, but regardless of what one may think about Christ, also from a pagan perspective or whatever, there is this aspect to it that is the aforementioned providential one. There are some people who have made it, all right, that have triumphed over death. Christianity is very clear that, of course, Christ has a totalizing universal meaning in this whole thing. And so the world is already redeemed by his sacrifice. The point is that according to tradition, and again, pre-Christian tradition as well, we are actually in the last and fourth age, and that things are not going to go pretty well from here on. And therefore, it's actually a last resort for God to essentially show us that it's feasible to make it. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a Christomimesis. We could simply say, oh, well, but, Christ has already decided because he's omnipowerful. And so we don't need to do anything, a bit like the Protestants really do. All right. Catholicism preserved instead the notion that in order to you should contribute, you must actually contribute to world salvation. Right, and so in order to do so, you should imitate Christ in practice. This is the point of Christianity. You would be surprised by what my actual background is. If you really to explain my sort of spiritual history, it's something I never done. But the question is quite evidently that there is a model to follow, and that this is not merely a passive obedience where Christ has just done all the work and we saved. Actually, the reason why Christianity came about is that, again, we're all kind of apparently blipped in the sense that the sort of hope is last to die, and there's going to be a great clash in the end time, as old tradition prefigures. Stiffening the ranks of heaven further for our human salvation is for maintaining an increasing connection with the higher perennial nature is the way we can finally make it to save everything, which is the greater promise, right? And we don't know exactly much of this. It's presumed that certain spirits simply melt away completely, and so there are people who are completely lost. And in any case, resurrection is warranted at least by divine achievement. So what Christianity did, in a sense of fixing the system, was surely getting rid of certain idolatric materialistic superstition, meaning that before, statues that people were to sacrifice to were not literally sacrificed to in a materialistic sense. It wasn't a form of, now I bring this kind of stuff to this statue because in theory there should be a spirit in it, and let's hope the spirit smiles at me. This is what essentially we understand religion today to be like. And the more we follow that trend, the more we reveal of how flawed we are toward religion and spirituality and God. But Christianity came to say, look, we have indulged in this too much because the great empire has morally collapsed, as it had to do, because according to tradition, prophecy, by the way, the Roman Empire was the last golden age, reappearing temporarily between the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron One, and it matched, but then things started spiraling down once again. So people basically became more materialistic, more superstitious. Superstitious means that there is something above you that is not you, right? So it's not like God is above you because he commands you. Above is, God is there, and everything you do wrong, he sends grace and makes you elevate and transfigure. Everything you do wrong, you simply remain where you are, and you actually lose through your sin and ever more life up to the point that you die. And if you haven't really achieved much in your life, you're going to not to earn even a little element of yourself in the firmament, and that is basically complete death. Now, Christianity denounced such the generation of the older tradition. And so even though Christianity itself actually stemmed from the world where this lesserness had arrived, and in this sense, the last pre-Christians said, well, Christianity is just basically telling us we have given up, and so, but we rejected. But this is what happened. At the end of the day, they failed. At the end of the day, they collapsed, and Christianity was largely, a matter of willful conversion by the side, probably of those who also held more power and saved what could be saved during the broader collapse of the wall. So this can be understood. I made multiple videos about the same. So the question goes on, it says, having listened to your channel at work for the past few months has really shaped my view that you might not only be the best YouTube historian, but the only good YouTube historian, period. And your videos have really helped me go through stressful shifts in a job I wasn't ready for. I work at a small shop in a huge shopping center. I guess it's a very fourth estate type of job to have. Again, I've been very harsh, and I'm perfectly aware of that, but that's exactly what you need to make you understand why this is a problem, right? The problem is not the type of job that you have per se. Even though technically, I can tell you this, the doctrine of the case is only slaves actually work. I mean, even the third estaters have somebody else working for them or have their wealth, in any case, maintaining them. And so floating in that way. If you have to work, you are a slave. So I guess that most people are slaves nowadays, kind of, right? So it may be a bit less shaming that what probably the concept fourth estate is, because there are literally people who are really low, and you sound articulate, and I understand that you may have gone astray as far as certain ideologies are concerned, but you may want to realize that, for example, your beliefs are directly tied to this kind of condition you find yourself in, and it is very difficult to understand how to come out of it, right? I don't have motivational videos like, I don't know, Jordan Peterson's, like, roll up your sleeves, tied up your room or something like that. But I think my videos are the ones that, especially in the religious history ones, that give you the most straightforward answer. I'm not like those American conservatives that tell you, well, you just do this and you'll always succeed, because this is exactly what we haven't been doing for 2,000 years. All right? And this is not about going against Christianity. If you think that you can come back before Christianity in that sense, this is not an antagonistic move. There isn't Christianity and paganism. There is a degenerated humanity that needs Christianity as a medicine to understand the more liminal fringe that where divine conquest, divine attainment, divine conquest of the world can be achieved, can be attained. And this can start exactly from a person like you. It can start from everyone, right? And the only point is that you have to make a truly superhuman effort, which entails, that's what the American conservatives will not tell you, a gigantic effort. More than a gigantic effort, because the giants were the ones who were defeated by the divine race. You have to do something that it's very difficult in this day and age to even reactivate or try to do, without especially the right spiritual cultivation and the and all that comes with this broader awareness. On Schwerpunkt, I try to do my best to raise awareness about this issue. I don't give easy answers. I don't, at least I give pretty straightforward answers. It can be tough to bear, but my work is expounding tradition. It's not having a personal take on it. It's like realizing that there is a very specific meaning and that it cannot be really equivocated. So paganism has nothing to do with restoring any degree of morality. First of all, the name itself completely prevents you from doing any of that, because it stems from a completely anti-imperial concept, and I would say also antisocial behavior, and this idea that if you go out there, if you isolate from the fray, etc., you're going to survive. You see the difference between you can find the war bands, the monastic chivalric orders and all this stuff, that you actually must go out there, must have this time of ritual death, going to the fringe of the world. But the entire point, also Christians understood very well, that after you did that, You have to come back to the world and fight and mold it and show what you have achieved, right? What pagans today do, neo-pagans, or however they call themselves at large, in a social-cultural sense, is alienating from the world, right? Some have some more straightforward clash against the opponents, but not because they are guided by a traditional framework. It's just like an instinctual, some of the lowest instance reaction to an obvious threat, to an obvious denial of their existence, their identity, whatever. But it stops there, right? These are rank and file, meat grinding sort of meat grinder cannon fodder. Really, there is no leadership, there is no spirituality, and there is no victory as such with that. And especially the notion that it's Christianity's fault, as opposed to looking at yourself and realizing that with or without Christianity, you're still a miserable person. Is the key to it all. Is the key to the fact that if you really even wanted to come back in time, you should go through 2,000 years of rise and fall of empires, of massacres, of genocide, of enormous effort, sweat, tears, blood, etc. And this is something that you can try to fix going backwards, but it's also something that you can fix by going forward and picking what was left from the past in a more universal sense, not trying to chop history, timelines, chronology, pretending that there was just a part of history that doesn't ring right to you because somebody else told you and you don't even know why, but in fact you feel even attracted to, like you're confessing here in this case through evangelization, and you just want to understand more and better, right? The only true way to that is represented by Catholicism. I would argue that Orthodoxy, of course, contains some of this, but Orthodoxy has problems that we explained also in many videos, especially in the Byzantine history playlist. And even though I absolutely support, I absolutely encourage anyone who's, say, from an Orthodox background to absolutely pursue his own roots in that sense, and that there are issues, maybe in a broader sense, but it's always up to you, right? How things really go. I truly believe that it's the word Catholic. That in fact, as we said, the Orthodox Church is officially named to also, just like the Roman one. That's the thing we should concentrate on. And in that sense, one can't blame Christianity. And I would also point out that there is a church that is Roman, and that there is a West that has achieved what the rest hasn't achieved. And I would argue that these boundaries transcend what you're possibly habituated to understand as a more nationalistic and or in the sense of like simply sectarily religious identity. I understand that maybe the Serbian background does that. For example, you claim to be a socialist. There I read National Socialist, but another thing I read before was also like this guy comes from Serbia, and there is some degree that maybe socialism at a point was part of your own identity, and so you feel nostalgic toward that, and there is something to it that you want to explore better towards. And there is something here that he goes on explains in the question. It says, as for that topic, I'm also curious, can you ever move up or down the ladder? Yes, I explained it. I can tell you that I have some aristocratic background, yeah, especially from my mother's side, which is German, thusly making me very Germanophilic, which is also grossly unpopular in Serbia, at least among the normies. So again, I suspect, look, if you're a Nazi, just tell us. It's not because of what you just said that you're Germanophilic, and even less, of course, that you have a German mom. But the point is, again, you're National Socialist, you're pagan, and you're Germanophilic. Do you know how many people I've met or seen that try to conceal the actual fact, right? It's easier to say. It's easier to say. Like, and from the moment if you declare, I'm a National Socialist, you will basically be able to move forward in a truly more national and social way. than you thought it was possible, right? And I understand that, right? Believe me, if you look at my ancestry, like we're much more, we have much more things in common that you probably mentioned. And you say some aristocratic background also from your fathers as well, but ever since World War II, we've been severed from this connection because the communists made sure that any inheritance we might have is taken away and seized by the state, which thusly, I guess, would make me now fall under the fourth estate. Now, again, I understand this, and it's dramatic, it's tragic. I know people who went through that as well, not in my country because first of all, we're fascists, so it's another story. But in other people who had similar stories in post-socialist context. The other thing I would like to tell you, because this seems to me to stereotypically go hand in hand with your paganism and this attitude that you have. I may suspect that you are also somehow let's say, frowning upon today's world order, how you would term that. That probably you see that there is some corruption or elite that doesn't work. I don't want to know. You don't have to tell me if you're against the Jews or something like that. But I suspect that there is something in the narrative. Because in today's youth, excuse me, I drink a little. Again, in today's youth, these ideas are very strong. Say if you're a Groiper, for example, if you listen to Nick Fuentes talking all the time about, ill about the Jews and essentially making Hamas propaganda, literally, and Marxist at the same time, because this is what one is doing if they're basically going against that target. There is literally another answer. And I gave it to you in the imperial Catholic traditional sense. I understand that if you're a Serbian, for example, you will not look favorably upon things like, the West in general, being superior to, say, Orthodoxy or the world you come from, or think about NATO's bombings and all this stuff. So I understand that it's difficult it's easy for me, because being from the other side, to me, it's very cool. But at the same time, I'm also, I think, pretty stern but fair, because I always take responsibility for failure. I mean, if my civilization was to fail, I would probably at some point try, of course, to salvage the elements that probably think were not too bad. I know this is really natural, not even instinctive. And it is good to have different voices from different countries. I personally don't have anything against Serbia, for example, or any other country per se. But at the same time, I can be proud of what NATO did, what my country did to yours in those particular circumstances, but because there was an actual reason that I can't explain. Then you will, maybe hate this idea, maybe hate me for what I'm saying. But the question is that you can't take off of the equation that if a good idea was to thrive, it would have won. All right. And this is what, in a sense, also Christianity tells us, that you can't even with Christology is a bit complicated because Christ literally goes for the self-sacrifice, right? And it is also, we haven't talked about this because of course tradition is immense, but there is a very explicit sense that that we are mortal only because we fear our own death. And so if you're able to show the world, as we said before, also in Christ's function, because it's not like the world was immediately transfigured, Christianity says it's so true in eternal, but what does that mean? What this means is that everybody, the last of the last, can win the world by literally self-sacrifice. This was very well present in tradition as well before Christianity. And Christ achieved exactly this, right? Showing that a human can sublimate his divine element as well. And that brought to Christianity's conquest of the world, right? But that was a Christ's accomplishment, and as such, this transcends, according to Christology, any other possible identity. I know that there are some parts of neo-pagan world that insistently stress the fact that Christianity would have simply diluted all this, the knowledge, especially of difference in terms of quality or in self-sacrifice, I'd say of glorious sacrifice, boasting sacrifice. But the point of it all is that not just the world has also diluted itself afterwards, because Christ's gone for a while and humanity remained what it was. And of course, in Christ's time, people understand much better what this was all about compared to today. But, and so this dilution is not less culpable than what the quote-unquote pagans did by themselves in order, for example, to let Christianity itself prevail. And because of its social-cultural fabric literally collapsing, their social-cultural fabric literally collapsing before Christ, right? So it's a universal problem, right? Christianity stresses the absolute of the divine, not because where you come from as a person, from which country, from which background in general, doesn't matter. It matters everything. It matters as much how low you can fall just to spring out once again. We've seen also in Indo-European theology that the moment of divine coming back is actually stemming from the darkest abyss. Saved from the waters, it's all encoded in our tradition and identity, in our words, in our entire belief system in Europe. So you say, I do not necessarily have a problem with this, the fact of the fourth estate, because I believe that an aristocrat remains an aristocrat, whether he lives in luxury or struggles every day to a crumb of bread, as I believe it is in one's character, education, most importantly will, meaning that if one aims for the sky, he will earn his place through hard, diligent work, a moral mind, and lots of sacrifice as well. So I absolutely commend your words here. This is the exact point of it all. At the same time, I would say it's not much that one remains an aristocrat per se, because in theory, if you look at tradition, everybody should have literally come from God. And so we were all divine at some point. So it doesn't mean that if you're an aristocrat, you simply remain an aristocrat, unfortunately. But it is true that you can definitely maintain that, you can re-augment, and you can't in that sense, for example, can cancel, because that's what we're talking about before regarding communism. What, for example, for you, it meant to be back in the day, I mean, not you personally because you're young, but in this sense, part of a communist state or a country that fell to communism, that collectively failed. You're not extraneated from this. You're not outside of it. You carry the fault of your ancestors. All this happens for a cascade of reasons that, in this sense, appear uncontrollable, but that you can revert exactly in the moment in which you understand that it is still your fault for not having fixed the system yourself, because your potential is infinite, as a matter of fact. So whatever happens to you, it's very harsh to say, but this is what we are as humans. We can't really lie about this. That everything that happens to us, in a way or another, is fully deserved. And this is brutal, terrible, because you would say, but also, I don't know, even an 80-year-old who dies of leukemia has deserved that. The problem is that we carry our ancestors' sins. And that's who we are. So even though, unfortunately, like post-traditional ideology tried to cancel this awareness, our responsibility is too well alive. It lives in our genes. As you said, I was an aristocrat, so I presume like I still have aristocratic blood in my veins. Yes, but this doesn't mean that it doesn't degenerate, nor that in this sense there is a fault. There is essentially something you have to fix along the way, and it can be crushing. If you look at how many generations humanity finds itself in this condition. And this is where all the evil of the world comes from. This is where all the terrible realization of the condition in which we find ourselves, where we're trying to narcotize ourselves from, rather than fixing, procures this kind of strange, let's follow that leader, let's follow that one. It's like a bunch of crazy, I don't even know which animals, because animals actually follow some kind of more concrete idea, but it's a headless, inconsiderate, in criminal actually attitude, considering especially the potential that we have as human beings. And there is so much that we constantly work on, that we constantly do, that we should simply fix by remaining cold for a moment and realizing our actual and fullest responsibility. So finally he says, I apologize if this email comes off as bothersome. I do not necessarily demand you to give me all that I've asked for here, but at the very least, I would appreciate if you could send me some videos or playlists where you explain the estates and hierarchy, as well as Catholicism predating Christianity. Right? So again, for like the answer, like I gave it to you to an extent. I don't know how satisfactory this was. You can absolutely find the playlist about Imperial Catholic tradition. The one about Christianity is actually pretty explicative in that matter, so check those out. It's perfect, I would say. It says, thank you sincerely. I don't say the name because, you may never know whether they want to be named or not. But, I must say this regarding, again, the harshness before, because I hear about this. Like, the fact that I am harsh requires a very specific explanation in this. You must understand that great part of what you hear regarding especially nationalism and socialism, as well as paganism, is not compatible with Imperial Catholic tradition. Imagine something brand new, something shiny, something that really gives you the full certainty that it needs to be done. And it is, in fact, so big that you have a lifetime to try to make work. And every time you do right, you get rewarded. And you can measure in that sense at every step of the way, if things do not work, how you have failed, right? These other movements at large always blame someone else, always deflect responsibility, always teach people to be less than what they actually are, right? And I would argue that it's incredibly difficult, especially at your age, especially if you haven't ever heard of these concepts, to simply veer off. I don't know exactly how old you are, but my impression is that, say, again, it may be difficult at this age to simply make a complete inversion, or at least because there are evidently some concepts that you have understood. So there is some intuition, there is some light, there is some awareness of this also. It's innate, really. It's actually already within you, regardless of whether you have ever heard it or not. The point is how much habituated you are to it in an existential sense, to appreciate to the fullest the fact that our, say, the boundaries in general, today's boundaries, the ones that most people consider as normal in any field, right, are actually to be entirely transcended in absolute power and divine perfection. And this is participative. And that's why Christianity is not passivistic in this. It's not really saying, we'll just wait. Right? If you read the Gospels are very misunderstood in general. Like the main message is like, just have faith and wish for it, essentially. And, it will be true, wink, wink, afterlife, you'll see there. That's not what Christianity is. Christianity is literally saying, if you want to start fixing this mess, realize that you have to throw all the BS away out of the window, all right? And then, only at that point, you will be ready to cope with your own mortality, and you will be able to step up. It's not non-recognizing the existence of the government, not recognizing the existence of the world, of its errors, of its monstrosities. It is about realizing that there is a reason for all of them. And if you don't want to realize that the only reason why the world is the way it is because of your sin, and that you have the single-handedly the capacity to fix this, well, then you know what your mission is, right? This is the most painful aspect. Actually, like, there were some times when I figured this out that I honestly, I've never really had a nervous breakdown, things like that, but let's say if you really understand the deepest implication of this, you do start freaking out, in a sense, because you realize that our world is something that doesn't fit the potential that you have. And the point is that we can't fix the world. We can transcend the world, not escaping from the world, but fighting to make it so high that it's not the world anymore, it's something else. And I think it's something beautiful, aside from, true in a probably in a spiritual sense, but it's also extremely difficult to do so without having made clarity about these very points. And again, I think that without this understanding, there can't be even any other broader recognition of all. That's why, again, I have told you, and as you've seen, your message was fine, but I want to sort of give a major, like to raise a major red flag in front of statements like I'm nationalistic and socialistic. Again, you want to sublimate your nation, you want your nation to conquer the world, to attain divinity. That's all fine. That's not what nationalism is. And it is not in the sense that it's not as right-wing as it sounds. It's way more right-wing than it sounds. It is that direction. It's not the other one. So if you deny nationalism, you can be actually way more far right-wing than a nationalist. And the nationalists will not understand that, because their logic is just, we're basically it's just the same logic of, a rat trying to abandon the ship. They don't even know that the ship is sinking in the mid of the ocean. They just want to be the first to come out. And this is what nationalists think their nation has to do. To do what with that? Nobody knows, right? And it's very easy to get, especially for young males, to be co-opted by this. And it's good for young males to be aggressive, to be risque, to do crazy things, violent things even. I have no problem with that in a broader sense. But it's because you have to learn how dumb you can be to be able at some point to command. Because otherwise it will be just a foretestator, again, sent to the front without even knowing why. And we have pretty large, exhaustive evidence, as your connational from Serbia after coming back from Russia could also testify to. And that's something you really may want to take quite seriously into consideration when you think about who is the world, right? What is nationalism? We all fight for our nation, and we should. Nations matter. Nations are not random. Nations are wanted by God. All right? But just like in the doctrine of the fasces, with the Roman lectorian acts, the concept of freemen, among your beloved Germans, for example, in the ancient world, just like we're talking the italics, greatest strength is not by one guy who commands over everybody. The greatest strength is commanding all together for the same identical belief. That's the strongest body that you can have, right? And unfortunately, understand it from a post-socialist, partially also from an Orthodox background, there isn't much of that model. It sounds like if you are from the side of the West, you are from the side, of the rainbows or multi-racialism or whatever. That's not it. That's a level that is probably not even to be taken into consideration. And also a great deal of honesty stems from realizing that even though every country, every system, everything has faults, you cannot make whataboutism, so to say, like, that my system is better just because this thing to me sounds better. No, like, you cannot. Power is an easy indicator of actual divine grace, and unfortunately, conservatistic movements, especially the Anglosphere inspired with their own sort of spiraling down of tyrannophobia, conspiracy theory, etc., has dramatically polluted also broader conservative movement in the world to think that if you're powerful, you have to fight against power. That's what foretestators do in tradition, by the way. If you're not in power, it means that there is something wrong. It's not like the foretestators themselves are not supposed to fight against you for you to be tougher in subjugating them. It's actually very important, but obviously should be defeating them. And there is an absolute collapse at some point if that lower level is let alone and in power. And I think that if you come from a post-socialist country, you know too well what it means. Everybody gets poor, and there are just few people who profit out of it all, and that's the dimension of the lack of grace, right? A nation is based on its moral force, and having just one guy that everybody obey to may come from a place where everybody's a sheep. There is zero moral force, but the few that really supports that guy. Or it can come from a nation of men that know what they want and align themselves with other men from other countries into the great endeavor of transcending their own mortal coil and achieving divinity for the world in a new golden age. And this is really what should guide us. It's not like dancing in circle with, again, flowers and it is actually even fighting against one another, but doing so for the right reason, for a veritable, honest, genuine struggle. And this is also what roughly the history of mankind has been about. And at this point, we live in an incredibly interesting moment where civilization still holds as a dam against the dark forces. And so if we don't support that, if we don't help that, if we don't fix what doesn't work in it, everything will collapse, including people outside. Again, it's not like when great empires collapse, people are free. Actually, that's yet another stage, like deeper in the grave of humanity, and maybe the other empires emerging later are maybe materially even better to some point, and actually civilization has something to do with it, and there can be ups and downs. It's not just a continuous fall. But the moral collapse is ever greater, and so it's mostly about greater amount of people to wield this might rather than any sort of greater mind and capacity to do so. So very interesting, difficult questions, especially the latter. I hope that my message was really clear, that this was not understood as an antagonistic stance on this young person, but it's actually the measure, like the spark that can be ignited through such words in such a fresh mind. Like, I know that life is difficult, that we are all impressed with that sin, that there are certain things that are very difficult to accept, that everything passes also through resentment, through shame, through hatred. But at the same time, when we experience that, we're able to grow from it. And that happens if we only because of our choice. Right? We can choose to do nothing about it, as well as actually do everything about it. We can try to we can actually destroy ourselves through those feelings, but by continuing to hate ourselves, or we can understand that it's only through the sacrifice that we can do better and that we can improve ourselves. It's very difficult. It seems like at some point there is no difference, that whatever we do, we go under anyway. But tradition is the light. It tells us exactly that it's a long tunnel ahead, but it's through faith and through this unyielding will that that same world will unfold in front of our eyes. Right? So, for today, however, I stop it here. I was happy to, of course, answer at least three questions. I had it. I have so many now, but my head is not working anymore. Anyway, I have to go to sleep. But in general, there are so many questions. I'm glad that I managed to cover at least three today and of this importance. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.